Are you Gen Z, Millennial, or Boomer? You might be surprised to learn just how differently each generation of men experiences loneliness, and how it sneaks up in unexpected ways. Maybe it's masked as silence at a dinner table, or disguised behind endless scrolls through Instagram. Loneliness has layers, and for men, it's often quieter, more hidden, and more socially acceptable to ignore. The idea that men don't get lonely, or shouldn't, is one of the stranger myths we've inherited. The truth? From locker rooms to living rooms, there's a deep craving for connection that rarely finds words. And it doesn't matter if you're 30 or 70. The ache is there. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all generations experience this ache the same way. And what fills that void for one group might widen it for another. Picture a retired baby boomer man. His kids are grown, his career's behind him, and the golf buddies aren't picking up their phones anymore. Now jump to a Gen Z guy. He's got Discord servers, gaming marathons, 100 mutuals, and still, something feels off. There's connection everywhere, yet it feels like none of it sticks. Loneliness for men is slippery. You can be surrounded by people and still feel like a ghost in the room. Here's something you probably won't know. Men over 60 report the highest rates of social isolation, but young men, especially those aged 18 to 24, are actually the loneliest demographic overall. That's not what you'd expect. You'd think retirement, widowhood, and physical decline would make older men the loneliest. But in reality, the emotional skill gap that starts young never quite closes. You just learn to live with it, and that's where things get heavy. Before you settle in, feel free to like the video if it brought you a little peace, and if you'd like to join us again, we'd love to have you back. Subscribe when you're ready. No pressure, just rest. Share something if you feel like it. Let's slowly drift into tonight's quiet moments together. You feel it first in the subtle ways. Maybe you notice you've stopped calling people just to chat. Maybe you tell yourself you're too busy. Or maybe it's been so long since you opened up to someone, the idea of doing it again feels like trying to lift a piano with a toothbrush. Generational shifts have created new obstacles to connection, and those shifts begin with how society expects men to behave. For baby boomers, friendships were once forged in military service, job sites, and community clubs. Emotional expression wasn't part of the package. You got a pat on the back and a beer, not a hug and a "how are you really doing?" The world didn't train these men to open up. So when life slowed down, and the job was gone, what was left often wasn't enough. Millennials grew up in a more emotionally aware world, but with rising housing costs, gig economies, and crushing expectations. They were told they could have it all, but no one mentioned how lonely the climb could be. You hustle, grind, swipe, scroll, and sometimes feel emptier than ever. That's the paradox: more emotional vocabulary, fewer real-life connections. Then there's Gen Z, digital natives. You might have dozens of group chats, thousands of followers, a meme for every feeling, but how many people could you call at 3 a.m. when everything falls apart? The intimacy of face-to-face vulnerability is harder to find. Instead, you curate. You post. You ghost. Loneliness here feels like background noise, constant, low-grade, numbing. Mainstream psychology supports this widening chasm. A widely referenced Harvard study on adult development found that strong relationships are the single most important factor in long-term well-being. Not wealth, not fame, relationships. And yet, men consistently report fewer close friendships than women. It starts early and compounds with age. Here's something interesting. A 2021 survey showed that 15% of men reported having no close friendships at all. That number tripled since the 1990s. That's not a gentle dip, that's a cliff. And no, it's not because men are suddenly less interesting. It's that they've been taught to equate emotional openness with weakness. Friendships, especially emotionally deep ones, require vulnerability. And vulnerability is still a foreign language to many men. A long-standing controversy surrounds the role of technology in all this. Some argue that social media and online gaming help men stay connected, particularly introverted or neurodivergent men who struggle with traditional social structures. Others say digital life is a hollow shell, offering quantity over quality and reinforcing performative versions of connection that leave people lonelier in the long run. Which is it? Probably both. And neither. Welcome to the paradox of modern manhood. And no matter the generation, loneliness doesn't always show up with sad music and teary eyes. Sometimes, it looks like workaholism. Sometimes, it's anger or apathy. Sometimes, it's an unreturned text that never gets sent again. The wound stays covered, and the infection grows beneath. Just a quirky detail: in Sweden, there's a government-sponsored initiative where elderly men meet weekly for fika, a structured coffee and chat time. It's helped reduce depression in participants by over 30%. A literal state-funded coffee break. Imagine that level of intentional male emotional care baked into every culture. Weirdly wholesome, right? That shift in energy leads us into something else: the way masculine ideals themselves play gatekeeper to connection. Across all generations, there's one common thread: the expectation that men be strong, silent, and stoic. But what does that actually cost? We'll head there next. You sit across from someone at a cafe. They're talking, laughing, gesturing with their hands, and yet, you're somewhere else. It's not that you're bored or disinterested. You just feel blocked. Like there's a glass wall between you and everyone else. And the weirdest part? You built it yourself. That wall is what traditional masculinity often looks like on the inside. It's not just about being strong. It's about seeming unshakable, emotionally bulletproof, untouchable. And over time, that armor starts to rust. It gets heavy. You don't even realize you're dragging it around until you're standing alone at your kitchen sink one night, wondering when you last had a real conversation with someone. Not a sports recap. Not work updates. A real conversation. You've probably heard phrases like "man up" or "don't be a girl." They're tossed out like gum wrappers, casual, reflexive. But they plant seeds. And those seeds grow into silence, into emotional constipation, into years of suppressing grief, joy, fear, everything that makes you human. It's a subtle conditioning, like water smoothing stone. Except instead of shaping you into something beautiful, it hardens you into a shape that doesn't quite fit anyone. Mainstream psychology has been chewing on this for a while now. A pivotal study published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology found that adherence to traditional masculine norms, especially those tied to emotional control and self-reliance, was strongly associated with negative mental health outcomes. Depression, anxiety, substance use, all traced back to the pressure to appear invulnerable. Here's something interesting: men are far less likely than women to describe themselves as lonely, even when they exhibit all the classic symptoms. It's not that they're immune, it's that the emotional vocabulary isn't there. You've been told not to name it. So you don't. You bury it. And it shows up in other ways. Take anger, for instance. Ever notice how quickly frustration bubbles up when you're feeling disconnected or overlooked? That's not coincidence. That's loneliness in disguise. It shape-shifts. It morphs into irritation, withdrawal, even risk-taking. You don't say, "I'm lonely." You say, "I'm fine," and then work late again for no reason. Or ghost your group chat. Or binge a show in silence with your jaw clenched tight. The issue has sparked significant intellectual debate. Is masculinity toxic, or just misunderstood? Scholars are split. Some argue that the problem isn't masculinity itself but rather the narrow definitions imposed by culture. Others contend that certain masculine traits, stoicism, dominance, emotional suppression, are inherently harmful in modern social structures. Either way, the effects are real. Men are hurting, often in silence, and the mask of masculinity isn't just hiding the pain, it's reinforcing it. An odd but true fact: in Japan, there's a cultural phenomenon called hikikomori, where mostly young men withdraw entirely from society, sometimes for years. They refuse to leave their rooms, cut off all contact, and live in total isolation. While not directly caused by masculinity norms, the social pressure to conform, succeed, and suppress emotion contributes to the condition's prevalence. You might think it's extreme, but in a quieter, less visible way, the emotional retreat is happening all over. Now pause and ask yourself this: when was the last time you told another man how you were really doing? Not just, yeah, work's been busy, but something raw, honest. Odds are, it's been a while. Or maybe, never. And that silence doesn't just affect you. It ripples outward. Your partner feels it. Your kids sense it. Your friends wonder where you went. And over time, the armor you thought was protecting you becomes a barrier no one can reach through. That's the paradox. The very traits you were taught would make you a real man are often the ones that isolate you the most. Philosophers have long debated the nature of strength. Is it the ability to endure alone, or the courage to admit you can't? Is it stoicism, or self-awareness? If you're listening to this, chances are you've started to question the old definitions too. Maybe you're realizing that resilience isn't about hiding your feelings, it's about letting them breathe, even when it's uncomfortable. And here's the twist: most men want deeper connection. You do. You crave it. Study after study confirms this. Men report wanting more meaningful friendships, more emotional intimacy, more presence. But the problem isn't desire, it's access. It's the deeply embedded belief that expressing those wants makes you weak. That leads us into the next layer of this strange puzzle: how early all of this starts. Because boys aren't born emotionally stunted. They're taught to be. The lessons begin early, on playgrounds, at dinner tables, through teasing and silence. So, how does that emotional distance get passed down like a family heirloom? That's where we're going next. Into boyhood, into the early blueprints of loneliness, into the moments when you learned to stop crying, and started pretending. You're 6 years old. You fall off your bike, skin your knee, tears sting your eyes. And before you even finish the first sob, you hear it: don't cry. Be a big boy. There it is. Lesson 1 in the emotional syllabus of manhood. It starts that young. And no, you didn't fail the test. You passed it, by learning to stuff the pain back down. That's how boyhood begins, with tiny, invisible punishments for vulnerability. You're taught to flinch away from softness. To trade tenderness for toughness. And even if no one explicitly says it, you hear it in the tone of voice, in the locker room laughs, in the way a hug becomes a pat on the back before you even hit puberty. And over time, you absorb the rules. You learn that being emotional is a kind of trespassing. But here's the thing: boys aren't born emotionally reserved. Research in developmental psychology shows that infant boys are just as expressive as infant girls. In fact, some studies suggest they're even more emotionally reactive in the earliest months. That innate expressiveness doesn't vanish. It's pushed down, redirected, replaced by performance. Remember how you used to cry during movies as a kid, until someone made fun of it? Or how you wanted to talk to your dad about feeling scared at night, but you didn't want to look soft? These small choices become habits. Habits become patterns. And the next thing you know, you're a grown man struggling to find the words to explain why you're angry when really, you're just lonely. Here's something interesting. In a long-term British study, researchers found that boys who were discouraged from expressing sadness or fear during childhood were significantly more likely to report high levels of social disconnection and depression by their early 30s. Emotional suppression wasn't just a personality trait, it was a predictor of adult isolation. You weren't just learning to stay quiet. You were being trained to be alone. An odd but true fact: in some Nordic countries, preschool teachers receive training specifically to encourage emotional expression in boys, using storybooks, role-play, and structured discussions about feelings. The goal? To break the cycle early and give boys permission to feel. It's small, but revolutionary. There remains considerable disagreement about how much of this emotional withdrawal is biological versus social. Some researchers argue that testosterone levels and evolutionary roles predispose boys to less verbal and more action-based emotional expression. Others counter that the environment has a far stronger influence, that boys could be just as emotionally fluent as girls if society didn't mute their instincts. No one has a final answer. What's clear, though, is that by the time boys hit middle school, many have already learned to internalize pain and dismiss connection. You see it in schoolyards, where affection becomes a joke. You see it in teenage boys who laugh when they're uncomfortable. You hear it in the silence that hangs between fathers and sons. And even as the culture shifts, the core script hasn't changed much. The expectation to tough it out is still alive and well. This early training doesn't just hurt boys, it follows them into adulthood like a shadow. It affects how they form friendships, how they handle heartbreak, how they respond to stress. Because if you never practiced talking about your emotions when they were small, how can you possibly talk about them when they're big? Think about your own history. When did you first learn that it wasn't safe to open up? Was it a coach yelling at you to man up? A parent brushing off your tears? A group of friends who turned emotional honesty into a punchline? These moments stick. Not in a dramatic, movie scene way, but in a slow, cementing way. One wall after another. And once that emotional scaffolding is in place, it shapes everything. Friendships become surface level. You bond over sports, work, shared hobbies, but rarely over fears or dreams or grief. And it's not because you don't want to. It's because you've had no practice. No one hands you a toolkit for vulnerability. Here's a quirky detail. In Australia, there's a grassroots movement called the Men's Table. It's just what it sounds like. Men gather regularly for dinner to talk about life, emotions, fears. No advice giving. No fixing. Just sharing. It started small, but it's grown fast. And you know why? Because once men feel safe to be vulnerable, most of them actually want to be. But it's hard to unlearn what you were taught in childhood. Especially when it was reinforced at every stage. You were praised for being strong, not for being expressive. You were comforted when you were stoic, not when you were scared. You learned to perform manhood. And now, even when you want to connect more deeply, there's a hesitance. A fear of seeming needy. Of stepping outside the role you were assigned. The real tragedy? Many boys never get the chance to rewire. They carry this emotional detachment into every area of life. Relationships, parenting, work. And slowly, quietly, it chips away at their sense of self. They don't even know why they feel disconnected. They just know something's missing. And that brings us to the next layer in this story, the adult male friendship drought. Because once boyhood passes and you're fully inside the man suit, friendships don't just become harder, they often disappear altogether. You stop reaching out. Life gets busy. And the deeper emotional needs? They stay buried. So next, we'll trace what happens when the boy who was told not to cry becomes the man who no longer knows how to ask for a friend. You scroll through your contacts, thumb pausing now and then. Names you haven't spoken to in months. Maybe years. You think, should I text him? And then, just as quickly, you don't. Not because you don't care. But because it feels weird now. Like there's some invisible threshold, and you waited too long to cross it. So you put your phone down. Again. This is the quiet drought of adult male friendship. You probably didn't notice when it began. There wasn't a dramatic falling out. No angry texts or slamming of doors. Just a slow fade. People got married, moved cities, had kids, picked up new routines. You got busy too. And now, here you are, aware of the distance but unsure how to close it. That silence? That's loneliness, wearing a polite smile. The data backs this up, and it's not exactly uplifting. According to a 2021 American Perspective survey, the percentage of men who say they have no close friends has increased fivefold since the 1990s. Not 5%, fivefold. Even more unsettling? The number of men with only one close friend has nearly doubled. That's not a trend. That's an epidemic with no dramatic headlines. And it makes sense when you think about it. From childhood onward, boys are often encouraged to bond through activities, not conversation. You play sports together. You game. You build stuff. Talk stays light. Then you grow up, and suddenly, shared activities vanish, but the emotional language never quite developed to fill the gap. So without those built-in contexts, friendship becomes awkward, unfamiliar territory. Here's something interesting. When asked how they maintain friendships, many women say they talk on the phone, check in, share feelings. Men, on the other hand, they often answer with things like, we play basketball, or we work on stuff. And that's lovely, but it also means when the activity goes away, often the relationship does too. An odd but true fact, in Canada, there's a men's group that meets monthly for something they call silent hikes. No small talk, no deep conversations. Just a group of men walking together in nature. And afterward, they report feeling closer, not because they shared stories, but because they shared presence. It's unconventional. But maybe the method doesn't matter as much as the intentionality behind it. A long-standing controversy surrounds the question of whether men are less capable of intimate friendship, or simply less permitted to engage in it. Some researchers point to differences in male and female brain chemistry, dopamine versus oxytocin responses to social bonding, as a possible explanation. Others argue it's entirely socialized. That if boys weren't taught to fear closeness, they'd pursue it with the same intensity and tenderness as anyone else. The debate continues. What's clear is that men often miss connection, even if they don't know how to say it. You've probably felt this in your own life. That growing awkwardness in reaching out. That guilt over not texting back sooner. That uncertainty about whether reconnecting with an old friend would feel genuine or forced. And beneath it all, that quiet craving for something deeper. Not just grabbing a beer, but being seen. Understood. Missed. But even when the desire is there, the pathways are rusty. Think about how rarely male friendships include phrases like, I appreciate you, or I miss you. It's not because the feelings aren't real. It's because they sound foreign, like you're quoting from a movie instead of speaking from the heart. And that distance adds up over time. Philosophers still argue whether friendship is a necessity or a luxury. Aristotle once said that friendship is a single soul dwelling in two bodies. Meanwhile, modern life seems to treat it like a weekend hobby, nice if you can swing it, but not essential. For men especially, the world often frames friendships as optional, even juvenile. You've got a family now, or you've got work to focus on. But the emotional cost of that mindset is steep. Because when men do lose friends, whether through drift, death, or distance, it hits hard. And often, there's no one to talk to about it. Grieving a lost male friendship can feel awkward, almost illegitimate. There are no friendship breakup songs or rituals. No socially sanctioned way to say, I miss what we had. So you bottle it. Move on. Tell yourself you're fine. Until you're not. Here's the quirky part. In recent years, there's been a rise in bromance culture among younger men, especially Gen Z, where platonic male affection is more normalized. Phrases like, I love you, bro, are becoming more common. It's hopeful. But it's also happening in a small bubble of the population. For many men, especially older ones, that kind of openness still feels alien. But what if things didn't have to stay this way? What if friendship wasn't something you outgrew, but something you redefined? What if reaching out to an old friend wasn't weird, but quietly heroic? It doesn't have to be a big speech. It can be a meme. A check-in. A shared memory. Something that says, hey, I still think about you. And this is where things start to overlap. Because when men lose friendship as an outlet for connection, they often funnel all emotional needs into a single relationship, usually romantic. One person to carry all your secrets, stress, joy, and pain. That's a lot of emotional weight to load onto a single bond. So let's go there next, into the risky terrain of romance as the only emotional outlet. And what happens when that one link breaks? You fall in love. It's real, it's alive, it's maybe even electric. And for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, you open up. Not just about your favorite movies or how you like your eggs, but the real stuff. The fear of failure. The sadness you never unpacked. That old friend who stopped calling. And suddenly, you feel connected. Whole. Finally seen. And now? Now she's the only one who sees it. This is where a lot of men find themselves, relying entirely on their romantic partner to meet every emotional need. It's not out of selfishness. It's out of habit. Out of a life spent being told that deep conversations belong in romance, not friendship. That tears are for breakups, not barbecues. And now, here you are, pouring every ounce of emotional connection into one person, and wondering why it feels so fragile. This dynamic has a name in psychology: emotional labor imbalance. It's when one person, often the woman in heterosexual relationships, becomes the sole emotional processor for the other. You might not even realize it's happening. You talk to her about your stress, your fears, your childhood. She becomes your confidant, therapist, cheerleader, and anchor. Meanwhile, you might not have another soul in your life who knows what you're going through. Mainstream studies back this up. A well-known Pew Research report found that women often have multiple emotional support systems: friends, family, co-workers, while men tend to rely primarily on their partners. And when that relationship ends, the emotional fallout for men is often far deeper and more destabilizing. Not just heartbreak, but full isolation. Here's something interesting: after divorce, men are statistically more likely than women to experience social withdrawal, health problems, and even early death. Women usually maintain support networks. Men, having funneled all connection into their partner, find themselves emotionally adrift. It's not just about love lost. It's about losing your only lifeline. And this isn't just about romantic failure. Even in stable, loving relationships, the imbalance can create subtle cracks. When one person carries the emotional weight of two, resentment grows. The connection strains. And even if no one says it out loud, you both start feeling the unspoken truth: you need more than one person to carry your heart. Philosophers have long debated the nature of romantic love versus friendship. Plato, for instance, saw friendship as the higher form, love without the mess of possession or expectation. Modern society flipped the script. Romance became the ultimate bond. The one. The soulmate. But when romance becomes the only space where a man feels emotionally safe, it puts enormous pressure on a very human relationship. An odd but true fact: in some relationship therapy practices, especially those influenced by systems theory, therapists recommend that men join, or rejoin, men's groups before engaging in couples therapy. Why? Because until men have alternate outlets for emotional processing, their partner remains the emotional bottleneck. You can't fix the leak until you redistribute the pressure. And let's be honest, relying on your partner isn't inherently bad. Intimacy is beautiful. Vulnerability builds closeness. But no one person can be your entire village. Even the healthiest, most nurturing partner can get overwhelmed if they're the only one holding space for your feelings. Think about your own experience. Have you ever felt like your relationship was the only place you could really be you? That all your pain, joy, stress, dreams, everything that makes you human, was crammed into one emotional outlet? It's like trying to fit an ocean through a straw. That's part of why breakups can feel so annihilating for men. Not just the romantic loss, but the loss of emotional safety. The one person you told everything to is gone, and now the silence hits with hurricane force. Women may cry with friends, debrief, reflect. Men? They often go quiet. Disappear into work. Or worse, spiral. This emotional funneling doesn't just make you vulnerable, it also limits your growth. When you only express certain feelings in one space, you don't get to explore all the other parts of yourself. You might be nurturing in your relationship, but stoic with friends. Expressive at home, but withdrawn at work. You become compartmentalized, like little sealed rooms that never connect. And that fragmentation makes loneliness even more acute. Here's a quirky detail. In some parts of South Korea, there are healing cafes where people, mostly men, can pay to sit and cry. No one talks. No one judges. Just tea, tissues, and time. It might sound odd, but the idea is rooted in something very real, the craving for a designated space where men can safely release. So where does that leave you? Probably somewhere between appreciation and pressure. You love your partner. You trust her. But maybe you're realizing she's been your emotional one-stop shop, and that you need more than that. That you deserve more than that. And this realization doesn't mean your relationship is broken. It means you're growing. That you're starting to understand emotional health like physical health. It needs variety, balance, and regular maintenance. You don't just eat one food, or do one exercise. You need emotional diversity too. That leads us into one of the most complicated roles in a man's life, fatherhood. A role that both deepens your emotional world and sometimes isolates you even more. Because suddenly, you're expected to be a protector, a provider, a guide, and maybe you haven't yet been guided yourself. Let's step gently into that space next, into legacy, love, and the loneliness of fatherhood. It's 3 a.m. You're rocking a crying baby in the dark, your arms aching, your head fogged with sleep deprivation. Your partner is passed out in the next room, and the only sound in the world is your child's sobs and your own quiet breathing. And in that moment, strangely, powerfully, you feel two things at once: profound love, and a sharp, aching loneliness. That's fatherhood. Or at least, one version of it. There's a cultural script about dads. You know it. Tough, selfless, competent. He throws a football, pays the bills, gives a stoic nod when his kid graduates. And maybe there's a hug in there, somewhere. A pat on the back if things get really emotional. But beneath that script is a very different story, one where many men feel unprepared, unsupported, and emotionally unmoored. Becoming a father is often described as the most meaningful moment in a man's life. And that's true. But here's the less talked about truth: it can also be one of the loneliest. Especially when you don't have the tools, or the community, to process the emotional upheaval that comes with it. Mainstream psychology tells us that new fathers are at risk for something called paternal postnatal depression. Yes, it's real. And no, it's not rare. Up to 10% of new fathers experience it, though it's often unrecognized. The symptoms don't always look like sadness. Sometimes, they look like anger, detachment, fatigue, or an overwhelming sense that you're failing at something you were never really taught to do. Here's something interesting. Studies show that fathers who had close emotional bonds with their own dads are significantly more likely to be emotionally involved with their children. That makes sense, but it also means that cycles of emotional distance often get passed down. If your dad didn't know how to open up, odds are, you're learning fatherhood without a template. An odd fact: in Finland, new fathers are given a baby box by the government, filled with baby supplies, clothes, and a booklet about mental health. One section is aimed specifically at dads, encouraging emotional awareness and asking reflective questions about stress and isolation. It's small, quiet, and deeply intentional. There remains considerable disagreement about what a modern father's role should look like. Traditionalists argue that fatherhood should remain rooted in protection and provision. Progressives push for emotional presence, vulnerability, and co-parenting. Somewhere in between, most men are trying to figure it out on the fly, balancing diaper changes with late-night existential spirals about what kind of father they want to be. And the truth is, fatherhood can pull men into deeper connection. It can crack you open in places you didn't know existed. Holding your child's hand, hearing them say, "I love you," watching them mimic your every move. It's raw, humbling, and beautiful. For some men, fatherhood is the first time they're allowed to feel openly. To love without irony. To cry and not apologize. But for others, the pressure of fatherhood magnifies the loneliness already there. Because once again, emotional needs get buried beneath the provider identity. You work longer hours to provide. You skip social plans to be present. And slowly, your world narrows to job, home, responsibility. No time to see friends. No energy to talk about feelings. You're a satellite orbiting your family, visible, vital, but distant. Have you ever looked in the mirror and thought, I'm doing everything right, so why do I feel so alone? That's fatherhood's hidden terrain. No one tells you how much you'll question yourself. Or how weird it feels to love so hard and still feel disconnected. From your partner. From your friends. Even, sometimes, from your own child. That feeling isn't failure. It's a sign that you need care too. And here's the thing, you're not the only one. Most fathers just don't talk about this. There's still a stigma around paternal vulnerability. Mom groups exist everywhere. Dad groups? Fewer. And the ones that do exist often focus on advice, discipline, or jokes about dad bods. But real emotional space? It's rare. And deeply needed. Some communities are trying to change that. In the UK, a group called Dad Lost Soul hosts regular meetups for dads and their kids, blending playtime with honest conversations about identity, stress, and emotional growth. And it works. Men who attend report feeling less isolated and more emotionally supported, not just as fathers, but as humans. So what do you do if you're a father who feels disconnected? You start small. You talk to one other dad. You send a text that says, "Hey man, how are you really doing?" You write down one feeling a day, even if it feels silly. You remind yourself that emotional strength isn't about shielding others from your feelings, it's about modeling what healthy expression looks like. Because whether your kid is 2 or 20, they're watching. Learning. Absorbing the kind of man you are. And if they see you cry, if they hear you apologize, if they watch you reach out when you're hurting, that's a kind of legacy that rewires generations. But even fatherhood, with all its beauty and challenge, doesn't fill the entire emotional map. In fact, many fathers feel lonelier now than before, because the stakes are higher and the time for connection thinner. And in our hyper-connected world, you'd think technology would be the cure. But is it? Let's slip quietly into the next question. Can digital connection actually soothe loneliness? Or is it making it worse? You open your phone. Scroll. Tap. Swipe. Message. Like. Watch. Repeat. It's almost muscle memory at this point, your thumb doing a dance it learned years ago. And somewhere in that routine, you might catch yourself thinking, why do I still feel so disconnected, even when everyone's right here in my pocket? Welcome to the age of digital loneliness, where you're never alone, and somehow lonelier than ever. For a lot of men, especially younger ones, the internet became the go-to place for social interaction. It's easier, right? You don't have to worry about eye contact. You can carefully word your responses. You can scroll through group chats and feel like you're part of something, even if you haven't spoken out loud in days. But deep down, you know the difference. There's connection, and then there's connection. Mainstream psychology has started to take this very seriously. In a landmark study published in the American Journal of Health Promotion, researchers found that high usage of social media was strongly associated with increased perceived loneliness, particularly among men. Not because the apps themselves are bad, but because they create a simulation of intimacy. You see updates. You get notifications. But the core human needs, being seen, heard, valued, are often left unmet. Here's something interesting. In user surveys, many men report preferring text-based communication because it gives them more control over how they appear. They can be funny, thoughtful, interesting, without the pressure of real-time vulnerability. But ironically, that control often becomes a barrier. You spend so much time curating that you forget how to be messy, honest, or real. And this doesn't just apply to social media. Online gaming, forums, Discord servers, group texts, they all offer slices of community. And for some men, especially those who are neurodivergent or socially anxious, these spaces do provide a kind of lifeline. The problem isn't the platforms, it's the lack of balance. In Japan, a growing number of young men report having their closest relationship with a virtual character, whether it's an AI chatbot, a gaming companion, or a digital girlfriend. And while this can offer comfort, psychologists warn that when virtual bonds replace real ones, the emotional consequences can be severe. A long-standing controversy surrounds whether digital interactions can truly substitute for face-to-face connection. Some scholars argue that virtual spaces create new opportunities for connection and even deepen some relationships. Others insist that nothing replaces the nuanced, sensory, and neurochemical impact of in-person contact, eye contact, body language, shared physical space. There's no resolution yet. Just a growing awareness that what feels like connection might actually be mimicry. You've probably felt it. You laugh at a meme with a friend but don't talk about the panic attack you had last weekend. You post a photo from a hike but don't mention that you felt alone the entire time. You share, but you don't really share. And over time, those digital veneers stack up until they form a kind of armor. Polished. Engaging. Hollow. Have you ever found yourself closing an app and feeling emptier than before you opened it? That's the echo chamber of online disconnection. You went in seeking warmth and came out colder. That's not to say online spaces are all bad. They're not. They can be lifelines. The issue is that for many men, they become the only spaces. You stop calling friends. You stop visiting family. You convince yourself that a DM counts as catching up. And it does, sort of. But it's like surviving on protein bars instead of meals. Eventually, your soul gets hungry. In South Korea, there's a phenomenon called hanjak, people who choose to do everything alone, eat alone, travel alone, live alone. It started as a proud declaration of independence. But researchers noticed something odd. Many hanjak participants reported high social media use, but also high levels of reported loneliness. They weren't antisocial. They were just stuck in a loop of digital performance. And the performance can be exhausting. Because even when you're trying to be real online, there's always the audience. Always the awareness that someone might be watching. So you edit. You present. You protect. And over time, that habit bleeds into real life. You start guarding your true self, even offline. So what's the alternative? You can't just throw your phone in a lake and move to a cabin in the woods. Okay, you could, but that's not exactly practical unless you've got a beard and a woodchopping hobby. What you can do is start balancing your digital life with intentional real-world presence. That doesn't mean deleting everything. It means using tech as a tool, not a replacement. Message a friend? Great. But also ask to meet up. Share a meme? Even better if it leads to a real conversation. Lurk in a group chat? Sure. But follow it with a call, or even a voice memo. Just enough humanity to break the fourth wall. Because at the end of the day, the internet isn't the enemy. Disconnection is. And for men especially, it's easy to mistake digital noise for emotional depth. But true connection, like the kind that soothes loneliness, requires vulnerability. Risk. Mess. And those are hard things to fit inside a caption or a comment thread. And speaking of hard things to fit anywhere, how do you express emotional pain in a world that still tells you to tough it out? How do you talk about your mental health without feeling like you're breaking character? You've got a headache that won't go away. Sleep's been a mess. Your chest feels heavy all the time, like you're dragging around an invisible weight. You know something's wrong, but when someone asks how you're doing, you still say it, I'm good. Just tired. Here's the unspoken truth, for a lot of men, the words, I'm struggling, never quite make it out. Even when everything inside is shouting it. Mental health is one of those things that sounds great in theory. Everyone says they care about it. We all repost the quotes. But when it comes to actually naming your anxiety, your depression, your intrusive thoughts, That's where the silence creeps in. And for men, that silence is especially deafening. Let's get blunt, the stigma around male mental health is still alive and well. Sure, we've made progress. You can talk about stress at work, or maybe joke about needing a vacation. But real vulnerability? The kind that says, I cried in the shower yesterday and I don't know why. That's still taboo in many circles. It doesn't fit the old script. Mainstream psychology has been sounding the alarm on this for years. Men are significantly less likely than women to seek help for mental health issues. Yet they're more likely to die by suicide, more likely to struggle with addiction, and more likely to have their symptoms go undiagnosed or mislabeled. You're not feeling sad, you're tired. You're not anxious, you're just burnt out. And depression? Well, that's just a rough patch, right? Here's something interesting. A 2019 study found that when men do experience depression, it often shows up in atypical ways, like irritability, risk-taking, or emotional numbness. These aren't always recognized as signs of depression by doctors or even by the men themselves. So they slip through the cracks, untreated and unspoken. Philosophers still argue whether stoicism is a virtue or a curse. Some say it builds strength and discipline. Others believe it chokes off emotional authenticity. Somewhere in the middle is the reality most men face. You were taught to endure pain, not talk about it. So you carry it. Quietly. Until it starts leaking out in other ways. Like anger. Withdrawal. Overworking. Drinking too much. Or just emotionally checking out. An odd but true fact, in the UK, there's a barbershop chain where barbers are trained in basic mental health first aid. The idea? Men open up more easily in familiar, non-clinical spaces. So in between fades and beard trims, some of the most honest conversations happen. Not because anyone said, let's talk about your feelings, but because someone finally asked, you doing okay, man? That's how simple it can be. A question. A pause. A space without judgment. But shame is sneaky. You might want to talk about your mental health and still feel like you're breaking some invisible rule by doing so. You might worry people will see you differently. Or worse, that they'll brush it off. That fear is real. And for a lot of men, it's enough to stay silent. Especially if you grew up in a home where emotional needs weren't acknowledged. Where getting over it was the solution to everything. You learned that real problems are physical. Tangible. Something you can point to. So when your mind starts slipping, you don't know what to do with that. You just wait. Hope it passes. But here's the problem, loneliness and mental health aren't separate issues. They feed each other. When you're lonely, you're more likely to feel anxious or depressed. And when you're depressed, you're less likely to reach out. It's a vicious loop. And for men, it often goes unbroken for years. Think about your own patterns. When you felt down, did you talk about it? Or did you isolate? Bury yourself in work? Drink a little more? Laugh a little louder at jokes that didn't really land? These coping strategies aren't random, they're survival tactics. You were never given the toolkit, so you built your own with duct tape and denial. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Here's a quirky detail. In Denmark, there's a national initiative where volunteers, many of them men, offer free weekly walk-and-talk therapy sessions in local parks. No offices. No pressure. Just two people walking side by side, sharing. And it turns out, that format massively increases male participation in mental health support. Why? Because it removes the formal barrier. It feels more like life, less like treatment. And that's the real shift we need, not just telling men to speak up, but creating environments where it feels natural to do so. Where vulnerability isn't some grand confession, but part of daily life. Because the truth is, you're not weak for struggling. You're not dramatic for feeling things deeply. And you're not broken for needing help. You're human. And humans aren't built to carry everything alone. So maybe the first step is just admitting it to yourself. Maybe tonight, in the quiet, you can whisper the truth, "I'm not okay right now." And maybe that one sentence is the crack where the light starts to come through. And yet, even when you're aware of all this, even when you want to open up, sometimes it still doesn't come out right. The words feel wrong. The timing feels off. And instead of leaning in, you lash out. Or numb out. Or disappear. So next, we're heading into that darker territory, how loneliness can show up as aggression, addiction, or emotional escape. Not because you're bad, but because you were never taught another way. You snap at someone over something small. A spilled drink. A late text. A harmless joke. And afterward, you sit there wondering, why did I just react like that? The truth is, you're not actually angry at them. You're angry at the ache in your chest. The silence in your life. The numbness you've been trying to ignore. But anger is allowed. It gets respect. It gets results. So it comes out easier than sadness ever could. This is one of the quiet tragedies of male loneliness. When there's no language for pain, it finds other ways to speak. Aggression. Addiction. Avoidance. Not random behaviors, but emotional smoke signals. Signs of something deeper smoldering beneath the surface. For a lot of men, loneliness doesn't look like sitting in the dark crying. It looks like road rage. Like slamming a door. Like disappearing into video games or alcohol or endless hours at the gym. And from the outside, it doesn't look like suffering, it looks like withdrawal. Or worse, hostility. Mainstream psychology recognizes this pattern. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, acknowledges that men often externalize emotional distress. Where women are more likely to internalize, becoming anxious or depressed, men are more likely to externalize through irritability, substance use, or risky behavior. In other words, when men hurt, they act out. Not because they want to, but because it feels like the only way to release the pressure. Here's something interesting. A study published in the Journal of Men's Health found that socially isolated men were nearly twice as likely to engage in high-risk behaviors, reckless driving, unprotected sex, binge drinking, than socially connected men. Loneliness doesn't just break the heart. It hijacks the brain's impulse control systems. And the behavior doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes, it's subtle. You stop taking care of yourself. You cancel plans and don't reschedule. You stop reaching out. You numb out with distractions, food, screens, substances. You don't feel better, but you stop feeling worse. And in a world that equates numbness with coping, that seems like a win. In rural Montana, a community-based project called The Men's Shed began inviting isolated men, especially retirees and veterans, into a shared space where they could do woodworking, fix bikes, or just talk. Over time, researchers noticed a sharp drop in alcohol-related ER visits among participants. Not because the men got lectures about drinking, but because they finally had somewhere else to put their pain. There remains considerable disagreement about how much of this behavior is rooted in biology versus culture. Some neuroscientists argue that testosterone increases impulsivity and reward-seeking behaviors, making men more prone to addiction when emotionally dysregulated. Others believe these tendencies are overwhelmingly shaped by environment, that it's not hormones, but years of repressed emotion, learned suppression, and societal permission to use rage but not grief. The debate continues. What's clear is this: unresolved loneliness doesn't just sit quietly. It festers. And when there's no outlet for connection, it often turns inward, or explodes outward. You might have seen this in your own life. A time when you were short with someone for no reason. Or when you started drinking more, not to celebrate, but just to forget. Or when you picked fights in a relationship because the silence between you felt louder than the shouting. That's not weakness. It's misdirected need. And addiction isn't always chemical. It can be behavioral too. You might get addicted to distraction, scrolling, gaming, porn, even work. Anything that keeps you from sitting with your own thoughts for too long. Because if you do sit with them, the loneliness creeps in. And once it's there, it's hard to ignore. But what if the outbursts, the numbing, the avoidance, what if none of that makes you bad? What if they're just survival strategies from someone who never got to learn the healthy ones? Because let's be real, if you never saw a man in your life model emotional regulation, how were you supposed to learn it? If no one taught you that crying is okay, that therapy is valid, that asking for help isn't a failure, how could you have chosen a different path? You were surviving the only way you knew how. In Norway, there's a pilot program where men recovering from addiction are paired with therapy dogs, not just for support, but to practice vulnerability. They're encouraged to talk to the dogs first, then gradually open up to counselors. It sounds strange. But it works. Because sometimes, all it takes is feeling safe enough to let your guard down. So what now? You start by noticing that spike of anger when you feel ignored. That numbing session after a rough day. That constant urge to stay busy. These aren't moral failings. They're messages. And if you can pause long enough to listen, they might be telling you what you need most: rest, connection, support. Because healing doesn't always begin with fixing a problem. Sometimes it begins with seeing the pattern and deciding to interrupt it, even gently. But there's another pattern looming, one that too many men don't see coming until it's too late: the loneliness of aging. When work ends, kids grow up, and the social world quietly recedes. Next, we'll walk slowly into that chapter: the disappearing friendships, the long quiet days, and what it really means to be an older man in a world that stops looking your way. The house is quiet now. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that echoes. The kind that makes the tick of the wall clock sound louder than it should. You sit with your morning coffee, stare out the window, and for a moment, you wonder when things got so still. The kids don't call as often. The work emails stopped months ago. The invitations to hang out? They've dwindled, or disappeared entirely. This is what loneliness looks like for a lot of older men: not dramatic, not loud. Just slow, steady silence. Aging sneaks up on you, not just in your joints or your eyesight, but in your social world. One day you're part of the hustle: meetings, errands, family logistics. And the next, you're trying to remember the last time someone dropped by unannounced. Or the last time you laughed until your stomach hurt. The world keeps spinning. You're still in it, but not always part of it. Mainstream psychology has tracked this phenomenon with increasing concern. Studies show that men over 60 are among the most socially isolated demographics. And while women also face loneliness in older age, they tend to maintain stronger social bonds, family ties, long-standing friendships, community groups. Men? Many struggle to replace the social structures that gave them identity: work, sports leagues, daily routines. Here's something interesting: a longitudinal study called the Grant Study, which tracked hundreds of men over decades, found that the single biggest predictor of life satisfaction in old age was the quality of relationships, not wealth, not physical health, not career success. Just connection. And yet, many men arrive at retirement having built a life heavy on achievements, light on emotional intimacy. In the Netherlands, some nursing homes have started intergenerational programs where college students live with elderly residents in exchange for reduced rent. The program wasn't created to combat loneliness among men specifically, but male participants reported the highest boost in emotional well-being. Why? Because the daily companionship, casual chats, shared meals, rekindled something simple but vital: being seen. Philosophers have long debated the meaning of aging. Is it a slow decline, or a chance for renewed wisdom? A shedding of ego, or a descent into irrelevance? Maybe it's both. But what's not up for debate is this: human beings need connection at every stage of life. And when it disappears, even the strongest among us falter. You might not think of your future self often. Most people don't. But imagine this: 20 years from now, who's still around? Who still knows your story? Who still calls just to check in? If the list feels short, you're not alone. Most older men report having fewer than 2 close friends. Some report none at all. That's not just a sad statistic, it's a health risk. Social isolation in older adults is associated with increased rates of heart disease, cognitive decline, and early death. That's right, loneliness can be as damaging as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But unlike smoking, loneliness doesn't come with warning labels. Just long, quiet afternoons. The causes are many. Retirement is a big one. You lose the casual social rhythm, morning hellos, coffee breaks, team chats. Then there's physical decline, aches, illness, less mobility. And for many men, there's the loss of a spouse. A partner who may have been their emotional translator, their social organizer, their reminder to reach out. When she's gone, sometimes the entire network goes with her. And the really painful part? By the time men realize they need connection, many feel it's too late to build it. The idea of making new friends at 65? It feels awkward. Foreign. Like trying to learn a language you were told you didn't need until it was almost too late. But here's the truth, it's never too late. Connection is a muscle. And like any muscle, it might be weak from disuse, but it can be rebuilt. Some communities are catching on. In Australia, the Men's Shed movement has spread across the country, offering spaces where older men can meet, tinker, and talk. It's not therapy. It's not forced vulnerability. It's gentle company. Fixing a lawnmower while chatting about grandkids. Rebuilding trust in human contact, one bolt and washer at a time. In some Scandinavian towns, older men are recruited to be public grandpas. They read to children in schools, attend youth programs, even serve as community mentors. It's not just charity, it's connection. A reminder that being older doesn't mean being obsolete. It means you have something to offer, and a right to receive warmth in return. So, what can you do if you're staring down the tunnel of aging and feel the edges fraying? You reach out, awkwardly, imperfectly, intentionally. You text an old friend. You join a book club, even if you haven't read in months. You go to a community event and don't leave after 5 minutes. You let your presence be seen, even when your mind says, "What's the point?" Because connection doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's built through quiet repetition. You also prepare. Not just financially or physically, but socially. Emotional retirement is a thing. And without support systems in place, the later years of life can feel eerily hollow. So you invest in your friendships the way you invested in your 401k. Consistently. Patiently. Without expecting instant returns. Because when the world starts to go quiet, your relationships are the music that keeps playing. But not everyone arrives at that silence unwillingly. Some men seek it out, deliberately pulling away from others, choosing solitude not as a curse but as comfort. And that raises a different, deeper question. Is all loneliness bad? Or can solitude be sacred? Let's head into that next, where isolation becomes intention, and where the line between alone and lonely begins to blur. You wake up and no one expects anything from you. No emails, no calls, no one waiting on the other side of the bathroom door asking where their socks are. The house is still. You drink your coffee in peace. You walk alone. Read alone. Maybe even travel alone. And for a moment, it's not sad, it's soothing. Maybe you even prefer it this way. Not all loneliness is accidental. Some men choose solitude. But that choice? It's often misunderstood. You've probably heard people say, "He's a bit of a loner," or "He keeps to himself." It's often said with a hint of concern, like solitude is a red flag. But it's not that simple. Solitude isn't always loneliness. Sometimes, it's relief. A way to protect your peace. A life crafted on your terms, with your boundaries intact. Still, the line between chosen solitude and silent suffering is razor thin. Mainstream psychology distinguishes between two related but distinct experiences: loneliness, which is the painful awareness of being disconnected from others, and solitude, which is the peaceful experience of being alone by choice. The key difference? Agency. If you feel empowered by your aloneness, that's solitude. If you feel trapped in it, that's loneliness. Here's something interesting. A recent study from the University of California found that men who reported high levels of deliberate solitude also reported higher levels of creativity, self-reflection, and emotional clarity. But the same study noted that men who wanted more social interaction but lacked it showed significantly higher signs of depression and anxiety. It's not the aloneness, it's whether you chose it. In Iceland, there's a growing trend among middle-aged men to spend solitude weekends in the mountains. No phones, no friends, no distractions. Just silence and cold air and time to reflect. Participants don't describe it as isolating, they describe it as rebooting. A kind of spiritual reset. And yet, philosophers still argue whether solitude is a sign of growth or retreat. Is pulling away from society a path to deeper wisdom, or a shield against vulnerability? Does time alone purify your thinking, or dull your social muscles? The debate is ancient and ongoing. What's often missed is the context. Many men who choose solitude do so after years of emotional burnout. You try the social thing. You invest in people. And sometimes, it just doesn't go well. Maybe you got betrayed. Or ignored. Or you felt like the one always reaching out. So you step back. At first, it's for peace. But over time, peace hardens into distance. And there's a danger in that. Because while solitude can be healing, it can also become a habit. A default setting. You stop texting people back. You stop making plans. You convince yourself that you prefer being alone, even when a part of you aches for something else. And eventually, you forget how to ask for company at all. Think about your own life. Have you ever told yourself, I'm just not a people person, when really, you were just tired of getting disappointed? That's not preference, it's self-protection. And it's valid. You have every right to set boundaries. To pull away when the world feels too loud. But the trick is knowing when solitude is serving you, and when it's slowly starving you. In certain Buddhist monastic traditions, monks are required to return to community life after long periods of solitude. Not just because they miss people, but because isolation is seen as incomplete without reintegration. You learn in silence. But you grow through connection. And that's the real secret. Solitude and connection aren't enemies. They're partners. You need time alone to reflect, recharge, recalibrate. But you also need other humans to test your growth, to challenge your blind spots, to hold your hand when you can't hold your own. The problem for many men is that solitude becomes identity. You start to think of yourself as the guy who doesn't need anyone. Who handles things on his own. And sure, there's dignity in that. But there's also danger. Because when something does go wrong, illness, grief, loss, you find yourself with no one to call. Not because people don't care. But because you trained them not to. And here's where it gets tender, you can change that. At any age. At any stage. Choosing connection doesn't mean giving up your independence. It means trusting that someone can sit with you in your silence without shattering it. So maybe the goal isn't to avoid loneliness or to chase constant social interaction. Maybe the goal is to build a life with rhythm, space for solitude, and space for closeness. You don't have to choose between being a monk and being the life of the party. You can be both. Quiet and connected. Private and loved. Because no matter how self-sufficient you are, you're still human. And humans need warmth. Eye contact. Laughter. Shared meals. That's not weakness, it's biology. And slowly, gently, that brings us to a turning point. Because for all this talk of disconnection and decline, there is a way forward. It's not flashy. It doesn't happen overnight. But men are healing. Quietly. Boldly. And it starts with small acts of emotional risk. So next, let's move into hope. Into healing. Into the quiet revolution of male vulnerability. It starts with something small. You tell a friend, "I've had a rough week." You pause a little longer on the phone instead of hanging up right away. You admit, "I don't really know what I'm doing," and no one laughs. And in that small moment, something shifts. The armor loosens. The mask slips. And underneath it? A man just trying to feel whole. That's the beginning of healing. And for many men, it doesn't come in a therapy session or a big emotional breakthrough. It comes in these quiet, everyday risks. Small moments of honesty that start to stack up. One truth at a time. You might think healing means being fixed. That suddenly your loneliness will vanish, your friendships will multiply, and your inner monologue will become a TED Talk of emotional insight. Spoiler alert, it doesn't look like that. Healing is messy. Uneven. A process that's more about learning to sit with your emotions than erase them. Mainstream psychology is clear on this. Vulnerability isn't just good for your relationships, it's essential for your mental and physical health. Research from the American Psychological Association shows that men who engage in emotionally expressive relationships live longer, recover faster from illness, and experience less chronic stress. Not just because they have support, but because they're no longer fighting their feelings alone. Here's something interesting. The hormone oxytocin, often called the bonding chemical, is released not just through physical touch, but through emotional openness. When you share something honest with someone and they respond with empathy, your brain literally rewards you. Connection isn't just emotional, it's chemical. In Brazil, some barbershops now double as talk spaces, where men are invited to speak openly about their lives during a haircut. The initiative, called Papo Cabica, translates loosely to head talk. The barbers are trained to ask gentle questions, encourage openness, and connect men to therapists if needed. Turns out, a haircut is less intimidating than a counselor's office, but can open the same doors. A long-standing controversy surrounds what we even mean by male vulnerability. Is it just about being emotional? Is it about crying more? Some critics worry the push toward male vulnerability demands a complete rewrite of masculinity, one that dismisses traditional strength or stoicism. But others argue vulnerability is strength, that choosing openness in a culture of silence is an act of courage. And maybe it's not about choosing one version of manhood over another. Maybe it's about expanding the definition, so there's room for the man who lifts weights and admits he's scared. The dad who sets boundaries and cries in front of his kids. The friend who jokes around and says, "I love you, man." You've probably seen this shift in glimpses. The guy who opens up over drinks when he thinks no one's paying too much attention. The older man in your life who starts asking more thoughtful questions. The little things that say, "We're figuring it out." Slowly. Together. And there's power in that slow movement. Because when one man opens up, it gives permission for others to do the same. Emotional honesty is contagious. One conversation can ripple outward. You might be surprised how many men around you are just waiting for someone to go first. Think about your own circle. Is there a friend you've been meaning to reach out to? Someone you care about, but haven't said it aloud? The next time you see them, try something a little different. A compliment. A check-in. A moment of realness. You don't have to make it dramatic. Just enough to let them know you're there, really there. Because healing isn't just inward. It's outward. It's choosing to build relationships that feel safer, softer, more spacious. And that might mean therapy. Or a support group. Or a recurring phone call with a buddy where you talk about more than sports and schedules. You might feel resistance at first. Vulnerability can be awkward. It can feel forced. You'll wonder, do I sound weird? Do I seem needy? But awkward isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. Awkward means you're doing something new. Men are biologically wired for connection. You've just been culturally trained to ignore it. The ache you feel when you haven't talked to anyone in days? That's your brain reminding you what you need. That longing for someone to check in? That's not weakness. That's your nervous system asking for co-regulation. And when you finally let someone see that part of you, when you stop pretending you're fine, it's like exhaling after holding your breath for years. You don't have to bare your soul to everyone. But you do need a few people, just a couple, who see the unedited version of you and don't flinch. That's where healing lives. In those small, safe places. So maybe tonight, you write a message. Or start a journal. Or tell someone, I've been feeling kind of off lately. It doesn't have to be poetic. Just real. And if they meet you with warmth, don't be surprised if you cry a little. That's not regression. That's release. And here's the most hopeful part: the more you practice vulnerability, the easier it gets. Like a door that stops squeaking after you've finally oiled the hinges. And if enough men start walking through that door, we just might rewrite the whole story of masculinity. Which brings us to our final chapter, one that doesn't just diagnose the problem, but reimagines the future. What does a new masculinity look like? One where connection isn't a backup plan, but the main feature? Let's finish there, with a new story. One you get to write. Imagine this: a man sits with a friend, both sipping coffee, and he says, I've been feeling kind of lost lately. There's no dramatic music, no nervous laughter, no quick deflection. Just the sentence, hanging in the air like an open window. And instead of brushing it off, the friend nods and says, yeah, I get that. That's it. That's the beginning of a new story about being a man. For generations, masculinity has been defined by what it hides. Pain. Stuff it. Fear. Mask it. Love. Better make it a joke. And over time, all that hiding hollows out the human experience. Men are told to be strong, but only in ways that exclude softness. To be leaders, but only if they never show doubt. To be providers, but not seekers of emotional support. But what if masculinity didn't have to be so narrow? What if it could stretch, make room for complexity? A masculinity where quiet doesn't mean repressed, and strength doesn't mean silent suffering? There's a growing movement towards something many call expansive masculinity, a model that doesn't replace old traits with new ones, but allows for all of it. Confidence and vulnerability. Grit and grace. Stoicism when needed, and softness when safe. Mainstream psychology has embraced this shift. Studies in positive masculinity have shown that traits like emotional literacy, empathy, and relational intelligence aren't just healthy, they're attractive, effective, and deeply protective against loneliness and burnout. In fact, men who identify with broader, more flexible definitions of masculinity report higher life satisfaction, better friendships, and stronger romantic relationships. A Harvard study followed a group of men for more than 80 years. One of its clearest findings? The men who embraced emotional openness, not necessarily from the beginning, but eventually, were happier, healthier, and more fulfilled later in life. Vulnerability didn't make them weaker. It made them more whole. An odd but true fact: in New Zealand, an all-male rugby team partnered with a mental health non-profit to film a campaign where players read love letters to each other. Not romantic, but brotherly. Honest. Messy. Full of things like, you inspire me, and, I need you in my life. The video went viral. Why? Because we're starved for models of what male love looks like beyond the locker room or the battlefield. Philosophers have long debated the question of identity. Are we born with fixed natures, or are we shaped entirely by experience? The truth probably lives in the middle, but either way, change is possible. And masculinity is changing. Right now. In barbershops and therapy offices. In friends' circles and Reddit threads. In fathers who tell their sons, it's okay to cry. But rewriting the story isn't just cultural. It's personal. It starts with you. With asking different questions. Not, am I tough enough, but, am I honest enough? Not, can I handle this alone, but, who can I share this with? Not, what do I need to prove, but, what do I actually need? This new story of masculinity doesn't ask you to become someone else. It asks you to remember who you were before you were taught to hide. Before the armor. Before the pressure. Before the quiet. Think back, was there ever a time when you were more open? A moment in childhood, or a friendship, or a love where you felt safe to just be? That version of you isn't gone. He's just buried under layers of survival strategies. And with care, you can bring him forward again. Some men's retreats around the world now include something called reparenting rituals, where grown men are invited to speak to their younger selves, out loud, sometimes in tears. It sounds theatrical. But the impact is powerful. Because often, the person you've needed most to hear from is you. And that's part of the healing too. It's not just about finding new relationships. It's about building a new relationship with yourself. One where you're not your worst critic. One where you're allowed to feel tired. To need things. To long for closeness. To say, I'm doing my best, and actually believe it. This isn't about perfection. You'll still feel lonely sometimes. You'll still wrestle with silence. But now, you'll know it's not your fault. And you'll know how to reach for something better. Because you're not broken. You're becoming. You're learning a new language. One that says, come sit with me. I missed you. I'm scared. I'm proud of you. I love you, too. And each time you speak it, whether it's to a friend, a son, a partner, or yourself, you're helping to rewrite the story of what it means to be a man. You've been holding a lot. Not just in the past hour, or month, or year, but maybe for a lifetime. And now, as we begin to close this slow, quiet chapter, there's something left to sit with. Something not quite finished, but finally willing to come up for air. This last stretch isn't about insight. It's not about facts or figures. It's about release. About letting go of the idea that you have to keep carrying loneliness like it's a debt you owe for being a man. You don't. Because the truth is, loneliness is not a flaw. It's a signal. A message. It means you are wired for connection, and you're brave enough to feel its absence. That's not weakness, it's awareness. And awareness is where everything begins to shift. Maybe your life has been marked by chapters of silence. Friendships that drifted. Conversations that never happened. Hugs that should have lasted longer. Maybe you've been the strong one for so long, no one thinks to ask if you're okay. But here's the reframe, you get to ask yourself now. You can ask, gently, what do I need today? Who can I reach out to? What part of me is asking for attention? It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It can be texting an old friend and saying, hey, I was just thinking about you. It can be joining a group, even if you only say a few words. It can be reading a book that puts language to something you've always felt but never said. Because healing isn't loud. It's not fast. It's quiet. Consistent. A little uncomfortable. And ultimately, freeing. In one study of men who'd built new friendships later in life, nearly all of them reported feeling awkward at first, but said the connection became more meaningful precisely because of that initial vulnerability. Because it took courage. And courage, when shared, deepens trust. In a small town in Italy, a group of retired men began meeting once a week to cook together. Not because they were master chefs, but because it was the only time they weren't alone. Over pasta and sauce-stained aprons, they talked. About their wives. Their regrets. Their fears. And eventually, their hopes. It was the first time many had said those things out loud. And they kept meeting. Every week. Not because they had to, but because it made the rest of the week feel less hollow. So maybe it's time to think about your version of that table. Maybe you need a regular coffee ritual. A monthly walk. A simple plan that says, this is where I show up to feel less alone. And even if you're not ready to reach out yet, that's okay too. Just recognizing the ache is a powerful start. Philosophers still argue whether loneliness is an existential condition or a temporary one. Whether it's part of being human, or something we can outgrow. But for now, let's treat it as something movable. Not permanent. Not defining. Just real. And ready to shift. Tonight, let it soften. Close your eyes if that feels good. Let your shoulders relax. Let the pressure ease, just a little. You don't need to prove anything right now. You don't need to carry anyone else's expectations. This space is yours. And maybe the next time you feel that ache rise up, the one that whispers, "No one really sees me," you'll also hear a new voice beside it. One that says, "I see you now. And you're not alone." Because that's what this was about. Not fixing. Not preaching. Just keeping you company in the quiet. Just reminding you, your story isn't over. And connection is still possible. Even here. Even now. So breathe. Feel the rhythm of your own chest. That's your life, right there. Steady. Present. Enough. Let it be soft now. Let it slow down. You've carried a lot in these past few minutes, stories, truths, memories, feelings you might not have looked at in a while. That's okay. You don't have to fix it all tonight. Just breathe. Let the weight rest beside you instead of on top of you. Picture yourself walking through a forest trail. Light filters through the trees. You don't know where the path leads, but for once, that's okay. You're not rushing. You're not performing. You're just here. The air is cool. Your steps are steady. You feel alone, but not lonely. Because you're starting to remember that your worth doesn't come from hiding pain. It comes from holding space for it. Maybe tomorrow, you'll write a message you've been meaning to send. Or ask someone how they're really doing. Maybe you'll go for a walk without headphones. Or sit quietly and let yourself feel something instead of pushing it away. Small steps. Honest ones. That's the work. You've made it through something big just by listening. And if this brought you even a little peace, then we've already done something beautiful together. Before you settle in, feel free to like the video if it brought you a little peace, and if you'd like to join us again, we'd love to have you back. Subscribe when you're ready. No pressure, just rest. Share something if you feel like it. Let's slowly drift into tonight's quiet moments together. Sweet dreams.